From a very early age, I was obsessed with making money. And around age 6, my 4-year-old brother was next to me and started drawing. And I discovered he actually had a really amazing talent as a 4-year-old in drawing. What I did was then to exploit that for the next few years by running art shows in our local neighbourhood. And I think my mum was saying today, as I recalled the story with her, that often my brother would be doing artwork and then be called away for lunch or whatever, and I'd tell him to get back and keep producing because we had an art show on that weekend. So from a very early age I was interested in entrepreneurialism and making money, to the extent that as an 8-year-old then I set up an ironing business with my brother as the sidekick who was doing the delivering. I'd do the ironing and at 5 cents a piece, and he'd do the folding at 2 cents a piece. So this continued for a while. I worked in a range of different shops, all different sorts of things, kept a ledger, was obsessive about money and banks and making interest and how I could move forward as a young kid. And then a little later on, I started working in a number of different fields, and they were mentioned tonight. I worked for St Vincent de Paul Night Patrol, working with Sydney's homeless for 3 years. And then I worked for 3 years as well as a Lifeline counsellor. And what I found over those 3 years was that it wasn't the typical people who'd been explained to me that would be calling those services, using those services, but in fact a very diverse group that included a lot of ex-CEOs, big company CEOs. In fact, one night I met a CEO in one corner of Martin Place, and at the same time I met the Ducks 3 years earlier of Sydney Grammar, who for various reasons was then on the street. And so I was starting to think about these sorts of things and saying, geez, what's gone wrong? What's gone wrong if the CEO, who we so hail, or the Ducks of a school, at a private school, ends up on the streets? And I went to a private school myself, where I was taught the values of competition and doing your best, and individualism was very much instilled into me, and authority, all sorts of things. And throughout this period, I was having some shifts in the way that I was thinking about things. The kinds of things that I was thinking about were, how come I can walk down to a park and sit there and enjoy the birds around me and think that everything's right, but then that night go out onto the street and see that things are different? How come we can be laughing with our kids, watching the sport, etc., but at the same time have a lot of depression and all sorts of things that is coming with this growth phenomenon? So I was living in Wollstonecraft at the time as I was going through this period, the beginning of my university, etc. And I left Wollstonecraft 3 years later because of primarily one thing, and that was that I started living in Wollstonecraft and using a very specific test to see whether I wanted to stay there. And I called it the smile test. Every morning I'd walk around Wollstonecraft, just out for my daily walk, and I'd smile and say hello to people. And at the beginning of my time in Wollstonecraft in 2003, I was getting about 7 out of 10 people who were responding with a smile. I left Wollstonecraft in 2006 because the number went down to 3. This was one of those high-density areas with lots of lovely people who didn't know each other. Communities that were disconnected because lots of them were working way too many hours in the week and struggling to actually meet their neighbours and have some leisure time to themselves. And so similarly, I was starting my PhD around this time, and I started to read books that many of you will be familiar with, like Limits to Growth, the 1972 report by the Club of Rome that essentially said there's a number of different tracks that we can measure for the future, and the number of them are particularly alarming in terms of natural resource use. And I was also starting to read a bit of the stuff that Clive Hamilton and Ted Trainer and Vandana Shiva and Ariel Soleil were writing, and the studies that were showing that both in the US and in Australia, that since the 1950s and 1960s, there'd actually been no increase in people's perceived level of well-being and happiness. My PhD began to really engage with this sort of stuff. I started to look at nanotechnology and its global impacts and its potential for reducing inequalities. And I started to see some similar trends around technological waves that came through. I started to get interested in this growth stuff and reading more and more about Limits to Growth and the way that it was manifesting. And I also got involved a few years ago with a filmmaker in the US called Dave Gardner, who is directing a film that I'm now co-producing called The Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth. Then of course, more recently we had Dick Smith come out and really ignite the population debate in some senses, and a lot more interest from business in terms of this crisis of capitalism post-global financial crisis. But throughout all of this, there was a strange irony that every time we've hit crisis when it comes to capitalism, communism, etc., that growth was continually put back as the thing that was going to solve the problems that growth had created. This absolute paradox just kept coming through. And the interesting thing here was that that cut across the political spectrum. We were hearing that from the right and the left, particularly in Australia. The challenges really at the heart of this, in my opinion, aren't that complex. But it's part of the kind of society we live in these days that we've over-complexified the issues around this sort of stuff, particularly around growth, to the point now that it actually becomes difficult for us to have a simple conversation about our futures.